Lacan, as an Analysand, is the reverse of Freud. We don't have the book of his dreams during his analysis. We don't have the faithful recording of what he went through, session after session, like Freud in his self-analysis, recorded all the moments he went through. We don't have the remnants of what were the moments of insight. We don't have all this. But what we know, that he underwent an analysis, not a self-analysis. The fact that there are no interpretation of dreams because there are very few known dreams of Lacan. Few, in fact, 2 awakening dreams. These dreams of a precise type, precise kind of dreams that were not isolated by Freud in his Traumdeutung, precisely. His relationship, Lacan, with dreams allowed him to brilliantly analyze the dream told by Freud under the form, "Father, can't you see I'm burning?" But confronted to the scarcity of the material, are we left without any possibility to inquire about what kind of Analysand experience Lacan had? Let's see what was the Analysand-analyst couple. For there to be an analysis and not a self-analysis, we need a psychoanalyst. The choice of Lacan's analyst was a forced one. Rudolf Loewenstein, trained in Zurich and Berlin, analyzed by Hans Sachs, arrived in Paris in 1925 to train the analysts into what was at the moment psychoanalytical modernity. That is the style of the Institute of Berlin. It was just after the crisis of the 20s in the analytical movement, the crisis in which the analysts complained that they had problems to reach the effects that Freud, 20 years before, could obtain with his interpretations. They complained for the first time that the Analysand knew already what they had to say, and that the Oedipus complex, the resistance to admitting their relationships to mother and father, this already was supposed to be known. So how to obtain a breakthrough effect like Freud had obtained. And so the contemporary solution was the invention of a psychoanalytic technique based on the working through of the resistance of the subject. How ironic today when we have the, how to call it, the records of what was the impossibility of analysis of Marilyn Monroe with Ralph Greenson, who was the main exponent of the analysis of resistance within the US context. But he was trained that way. And to see how this wonderful system of the supposed work through of the resistance, how did it break down within the context of the impossible analysis of Marilyn, is quite an interesting reading. We always learn better from the failures than from the success. Loewenstein was a real believer in the new technique. He believed in maintaining a strict, very strict framework from the duration of the session, their number per week, all the analytic let's say ruling that went with it. And Lacan was therefore confronted with a rigid and idealistic standard for 6 years, beginning in the autumn of 1932. Within the analysis, the ideal of the analysis of resistance, the end of the cure was strictly correlated with the reduction of the transference to zero. Not only not having anything to say, not having the analyst reduced to that object there, but really to zero. And the analysand and the analyst were supposed to be able to interpret the transference without any remnants, to make it absolute transparency at the end. Against what happened with Marilyn is a recording of how strange is that idea that what happens in transference can one day be absolute glasnost, absolute transparency. The common point between the analyst and the analysand, between Lacan and Loewenstein, were their charisma, recognized by the community, their charm, their position as seducers, their narcissism in a way. By the way, it is his background as seducers that detours Rudolph from the strict rules that he advocates. He became the lover of Princess Bonaparte on November 2, 1926. Marie Bonaparte had a diary in which he recorded precisely that afternoon where he came to see her. So we have the exact moment, including the hour in the afternoon. And he became the lover of Princess Bonaparte after having analyzed her son the previous year and maintaining an analytic link with the son who had problems. Their liaison did not prevent the princess from wanting to put an end to her frigidity by undergoing surgery of her clitoris on April 20, 1927, 1 year after. Freud, the analyst of the princess, was unable to prevent her from doing so. She had all that theory that with the surgery, she could really place her clitoris in the right position. There was a film made by Benoît Jacot, the director that filmed Lacan precisely. He made a film about the princess Bonaparte called The Princess. And in the film, Lovenstein is represented as a very likable person, a handsome actor, has its part, and it's quite the way in which Lovenstein, whose nickname was Love, was really in this position within the community. The competition between Lovenstein and Lacan is clearly marked and was clearly marked in the transference. Lacan made a declaration declared to a friend, or to a family, a dream he made on the couch. And this dream is confirmed by what Jacquelin says in his Vie de Lacan, in his life of Lacan, in which he said, for Lacan, the word stop never existed. And while driving or being a passenger in a car, he loathed to stop. Stop. The red lights, the stop signs. He hated that. And Jacquelin recalls a souvenir he had that Lacan sitting in a car, drive by Judith, comes to a red light. Of course, Judith stops. Lacan comes down from the car and walks just through the... Not to be stopped, precisely. And so the dream he told that he made during the analysis is probably true. He said one day, it's not a dream. It's something that happened during the analysis. One day, as he was driving his small car in a tunnel, he saw a large truck coming towards him. And so he went straight to it, didn't move. It was the truck that gave way. Oui. The atmosphere of the analysis was quite tense. And the relationship between acting out and passage à l'acte was on a thin line. But we can see it was a metaphor of the negative transference or the aggressive transference that was in it. It's clear that this acting out, aiming straight at the truck, was a metaphor of what was at stake during the analysis. who will give way in the cure. But it was not only Lacan's fault, or due to his character, or due to his megalomaniac position. It was that Lacan was forced between this rigid standard, and he wanted to find a way out of it. The analysis was clearly aimed at taming Lacan, making him normal, not that kind of strange, brilliant fellow he was. Make him comply to the rules. And we see that in the end of the analysis. After 6 years, at that time it was a very long time of analysis. After 6 years, he was supposed to be nominated as an ordinary member of the Paris Society, Paris Institute. And the analyst told him that they agreed, the Institute agreed to nominate him as a member under the condition that he continue his analysis when already everything was consummated between the both partners. The Institute meant, in reality, the princess, who could do everything what she wanted in there. And the princess wanted Lacan to be more normalized. And so she pressed the fact that he had to keep on with an analysis, and then he would be accepted as an ordinary member. This absurd forcing was meaningless. At that time, the ordinary members were quite an elite. There were a dozen of them. And Lacan was the psychiatric reference they needed. One can see why Lacan, and not only from the Ferexian influence, considered negative transference as a decisive element of psychoanalytical practice. He called it, in his early writings on psychoanalysis, he called it the inaugural knot of the psychoanalytical drama. At the end of the analysis, without doubt, Lacan had a negative transference towards his analyst, towards the psychoanalytical establishment, extended to the Princess Bonaparte, and even to the founding king. When Freud, coming in exile from Vienna, passed through Paris, he was living in Marie Bonaparte's villa in Paris, in Saint-Cloud. And to see Freud, one has to ask for the permission to Marie Bonaparte. And Lacan preferred not to see Freud and never asked nothing to Marie Bonaparte. Another facet of the analysis is faced with all this normative device everything seems to happen as if Lacan wished to force something in his love life. He tried to normalize himself. He, who defined man's desire as centrifuge, since 1929, he divided his affection between Marie-Thérèse and Olesia. Olesia was the second neglected wife of his friend Drieux La Rochelle. It's Olesia who typed his thesis, published in 1932. Their liaison lasted until 1933. In the fall of 1933, that is, after 1 year of analysis, the Analysand falls in love with the sister of one of his friends in the residence in the hospital and asks her to marry him. They marry 1 year after, less than 1 year after. They met in the autumn of 93, and they are married on February 29, 1934, 6 months after. This marriage lasted until he fell madly in love with Sylvia Bataille in November 38. Although in the meantime, Lacan was often torn, like he said, between two women. We have therefore the impression that the first effect on psychoanalysis on Lacan and Analysand was an attempt of that normalizing his relations with women. The marriage seemed for him a solution only as long as the analysis lasted. That is a mere 5 years for the marriage. The moment it stops, it breaks down. The failure of the imaginary normativation during his psychoanalysis is also marked in the relations with the analyst. In 1953, when the scission happened within the Paris Analytical Institute, his analyst was still driven by a jealous passion and the will to defeat his former Analysand. This we see in the letter he sent to Princess Bonaparte during the session, as well as in the pathetical theoretical response to Lacan's texts of 1953, called The Function of and Field of Speech in Languages and Psychoanalysis. The response was a text published by Lovenstein under the title Speech in Psychoanalytic Technique. He mixes Saussure and Jacobson in bloodless description of the verbalization of the ego. He can only quote Lacan as editor of the first issue of the journal Psychoanalysis. This gives us quite an idea of what really was a relationship beyond the analysis. The relationship between the analyst and the production of his Analysand, too well gifted. We can have an idea of the point reached by Lacan, Analysand. In the long letter he sent to Lovenstein after the session of 53. In this long letter, Lacan states all the details of the unfolding of the institutional facts that mark the session. And he says, not for accuracy purposes, but to make the truth of his position better understood. That's what he says. We can hear in this letter how Lacan transmits to his former analyst the new certainty he had acquired meditating on his analytical experience outside of the analysis. This certainty he describes in that letter will be of use for him in the description of that he will make 10 years after, in of the what happens, of what should happen in the past. We see how he doesn't believe anymore in his analyst, including his beyond rivalry. He listens with some kind of interior voice. Let's quote him. He says, I dream of that kind of faith that leads me now beyond all this, beyond all what happened during the institutional turmoil. To that what now I know more and more is what I have to say regarding an experience whose nature I have only been able to recognize and therefore to really understand these last few years. I hope to see you in London. Whatever happens, you should know that you will find there a man more certain of his duties and his destiny. These pages were not written to contribute to a dossier, but to give you the free tone allowed by our special relationship and the testimony of what I've been through, without which history could not be written. No objectivity can be reached in human matters without this subjective basis. End of the quote. The way in which Lacan describes the end of analysis is a strict report of his own experience. Destitution of the subject supposed to know, production of a decided desire, intermingling of duty and destiny, sensation of désêtre, unbeing, sensation of having something to do, no more states of mind, having something to say and to do. We can see also at the end of the parcours of the 6 years of analysis of Lacan, the way he adapted what he had learned as a psychiatrist in his thesis of 1932, how he adapted this to a psychoanalytic investigation. When he calls the results of analysis the reverse effect of the symptom, the creative effects of the symptom. that have to be obtained at the end. At the same time, his reminding of what he had learned within the mechanistic school of his psychiatric master, Laurent, that the symptom is always constituted by a formal envelope, he called it. What Laurent considered mechanistic, he called it formal envelope. But this can be put at work during the analysis and produced at the end a kind of sublimation. A sublimation not considered as the inscription of what is admitted within civilization, but rather the sublime effects of the possibility to make the symptom as such recognized within civilization. That's one aspect of it. But more profoundly, what he was investigating in his dissertation on the case of Aimé was the key to feminine passion that he wanted to find. Aimé is the mystery he wanted to solve. The death drive in women and their passage à l'acte. Freud had left us with this question: what do women want? Lacan decidedly went inside the zone where what do women want has a clear answer. They want to hit men in what they have the more precious to them. And they want to make them the object of their mad love. At the same time, what Lacan searched in women and he obtained was a kind of intense love, let's put it that way, with the risks that were at stake. What Lacan analyzed in Aimé announces what he will then publish on the cases of the sister Papin, who murdered two, it's a femme de ménage, cleaning women that murdered their employers in a strangely savage way. They were absolutely ordinary peasants who, after the passage à l'acte, left in the bourgeois atmosphere of the Paris of the 30s, spatially terrified the employers of all cleaning women. And also the way in which Lacan analyzed the case of Médée, the tragic figure, or the case of Madame Gide, destroying all the letters that Gide sent her, or in the 60s, at the end of it, commenting on the film The Empire of the Senses, or the way commenting the mystiques. Lacan himself is not a mystique of feminine jouissance, but a passionate decoder of the feminine position of sexuation, of which he will end up by giving them a theme, the vathema. It's no doubt that Lacan and Analysand wanted to decode above anything else that position, and that is why the normativation of marriage could not be anything more than a trompe-l'œil. Having given his own response, not a universal response, but the response he was interested in. He was interested by women who precisely could hit him. And his own desire allowed him to analyze what he thought of the Freud's position and reproached Freud for having confused the woman and the hysteric. Let's quote. Freud, he said, would have certainly become an admirable and passionate idealist had he not dedicated himself to the other under the form of the hysteric. It's strong to call Freud an admirable and passionate idealist. It's a clinical category. And it's probably more precise than the strange declarations of Frederick Cruz. That's things that if Freud was passionate and idealist, it was because he took cocaine during 15 years. It's true that on and off, Freud took cocaine during more or less 15 years. More at the beginning, and when he saw the consequences, he cut off. But he used them for some time. But it was an idealist and a passionate much before that. Lacan did not dedicate himself to the other. And that, in his Vie de Lacan, Jacques-Alain Miller shows it. That's why you can see how Freud dedicated himself to the other. But also, he was not a passionate idealist of feminine jouissance. The passionate idealist is aimé. That's a category he attached to her. But Lacan's report on feminine passion allowed him to extract from his mesima a response to the jouissance of the woman when precisely she lashes out. Is this an awakening? Perhaps we can now return to the dream that Lacan described in his seminar 11 and see how it can resonate with what we said. He said, "The other day, was I not awakened from a short slumber as I tried to rest by something knocking on my door even before I woke up? The thing is that with this knocking, I had already created a dream that told me something else besides the knocking itself. That I know that I am within the scope of awakening, I am knocked, he concludes. So, then he doesn't want to objectify the fact that the knocking wakes him up, the noise itself. He said the fact that he was waken up. First, the knocking, the noise itself, went into the dream. And into the dream, if he hears the knocking, they have a special meaning for him as a dreamer. He was knocked. Like I said yesterday, the dreamer is the dream. If we consider that the knocking on the door were made by Gloria, his secretary, wake him up from his usual slumber in the afternoon. It was a woman who knocks at the door. And what's more, what interests him, what wakes him up, is to be in a position in which he is knocked in response to the action of a woman. Let's there connect the knocking of Aimé and the awakening knocks. Lacan Analysand is the one who was able to dream beyond Freud and face the unbearable of the feminine question for a man in terms that would renew psychoanalysis in a decisive way. Helped by the formal resources given by the structured, given by his friend Lévi-Strauss, and learned from Jacobson. This undoubtedly allowed him to pursue the Spinozan dream of his adolescence. But the Analysand Lacan would move forward without the support of the established discourse in his own confrontation with women and the feminization implied by the position of the analyst. From his analysis to what he finally transmitted in Encore, we can see the red thread. At the end, he spoke of a love that he called a more dignified love. He hoped to produce with analysis a more dignified love. To hear what he wanted to say, in the dignified, we have to hear the das Ding that's included there, the thing as such included in the circuit of love. And when he tried to formulate this, that what psychoanalysis can add to the immense literature on love, the idea of a more dignified one who could include all the charge of jouissance, including all the fateful aspects that can be present in the passionate passage à l'acte that accompany that kind of too dignified love. Thank you. So the first question, between the mad love and the dignified love. Yes, it's a very good one. And it's precisely the knot between these two aspects that intrigued really Lacan. And he tried to sort out these relationships all along his teaching. since aimer, since his psychiatric dissertation of 32, until the end of his seminars and writings, he tried to sort out this. And the fact that it's not easy and even impossible to quite separate this. And at the same time, they are linked in a way, but beyond that, it has to be separated as such. Mad love, in the sense of psychotic love, is one thing. Mad love is another one. And the more dignified love is the articulation of this madness that for him is at stake in questions of love. And like you recorded quite appropriately, the elevation of an object in the position of the thing, which is a description of the process of love as such. It's not, it's true, that easy to separate this or to articulate properly these distinct aspects. But let's try. One way, or what I would propose to follow the path that you opened, is to recall the formula he gave, in which he said the distinction between men's love and women's love, the men's style of loving is fetishistic, and he said the woman's style is erotomaniac. What does that mean? Enfin, it has to be commented upon. It's striking, at least for the fact that from the women's side, always madness and love are linked in a special way. It's quite Freudian. I mean, Freud said, love is a madness. In its texts of 1916 on melancholy, he said, love is a suicide of the ego. But let's put it the strong way. It has a kind of suicidal aspect that's there. Crimes of passion are always the horizon of love. And that's why François Regnault recalled it recently in the Lacan seminar, that when Lacan spoke about love in the 60s, it sounds strange because in the 60s everybody spoke about sex, not about love. It sounds bizarre to recall that you can dream of all the sexual liberation that you want. The problem is that we find the limits of love, which is much more, let's say, dramatic in its consequence, as any sexual liberation would do. Because whatever is sexual liberation is not a liberation from love. At the end, you topple yourself with the paradoxes of love. So when he said, from the women's side, love is, the style of love is erotomaniac. In a way, it's an answer to Simone de Beauvoir. You remember, if you've read The Second Sex, that at the end of The Second Sex, the thesis of Simone de Beauvoir is that women in history were deprived of action, of being an agent in the action that concerned their destiny. And so, as deprived of this action, they had to make the other, that is men, speak about them. That's why, she said, in history, women seem like a void cipher. This vacant place being filled up by the declaration of men about women. And she describes some kind of typical figures of the relationship between men and women in history, kind of zeitgeist figures, reminding of Hegel. And she described the position of the mystique, the lover, in which women try to identify themselves in a position in which they force their lover, for instance, to speak about them. Or they force God to send them messages. And she described this in a kind of Marxist approach, or neo-Marxist approach, in which what is forced upon the subject by the condition of history, the subject makes him, incorporates it, and identifies with it. So, the conditions of history that made women silent, they incorporate it, and in their subjective position, identify with the position of the silent one that provokes the discourse of the other. That was more or less the end of the Second Sex. What Lacan answers to that is that it's true that women were always described, were talked about. He said diffamation. Diffamation, les femmes, alors you have the French one, diffamation, which is slander. And at the same time, it's a said famation. You can see the Latin fama, the reputation that is told by the other, or the homonymy between diffame and diffamer. Okay? Between slandering and to, they are said women. Okay, diffame. All these, this approach is a summary of the position of Beauvoir. Women were always in history talking about and described from the outside, reduced to silence. Okay. What Lacan adds, it's that it's not due to history, to the conditions of history. There's something more structural in it. And that's why he said that in the women's style of love, they force the other to speak about them. That's the erotomaniac aspect, in which, in the clinical category of erotomania, the subject, the woman, receives order from the other. The other, as such, in its voices, in its messages, always comment upon her. It's not like a mental automatism, like in the position of men, in which one can hear in the voices a comment on what he says, a comment on his acts, a ceaseless comment. He does this, he moves his arm. Anything is commented upon, but it's self-commented. While in the erotomaniac aspect, it's the other that says, to please me, you must do that. If you love me, you must do that. And the subject is submitted to orders very strict that come as proof of his love. And so the answer in which Lacan tried at the same time to incorporate what the Sartre-Beauvoir position was, is it's only that through history, this feminine condition appeared because we were in a change about that period. It appeared in the 20th century, due precisely to the emancipation of women, that before that, in history, they were silenced upon. Because for the first time, historical conditions allowed women to make themselves heard. Okay. But so what Lacan says is that the erotomaniac aspect still are most structural. And even if we will live in a world in which women will lead the world, even if they were to be the maximum agents of their destiny, the question won't be solved. It's not history that will solve this. And it's not the fact that within civilization, women can enter in the civilization of contracts, of work, of leadership. It won't solve the fact that they want their lover to say something to them, and to say something precise, something that speaks of her, something that hits the right spot, and not the G-spot, hits the right spot in their definition of what they think of themselves, what they cannot see of themselves. Tell me more about me. And not in a narcissistic position. That's what Lacan said, that usually this is treated as the narcissism of women, when he said absolutely the reverse. It's because they don't have a narcissism that the other has to speak for them. Men have a narcissistic position because they identify with the phallus. They know they have one. In fact, they think they have one. And so they have the anxiety to lose it. But this defined the narcissistic male position. And so the declaration of the erotomaniac nature of feminine love is at the same time, let's say, an answer and a displacement of the question of feminine love and what will be its place in a world in which precisely leadership and feminine position will always be more and more intertwined. Would you think it answers to your question?
Yes, it clarifies much, casts also much shadow.
Attends, wait.
What my question would then be to follow up is how, to what extent is this not a complementarity to the male fetishistic position, which of course we don't want, I assume we don't want. So
That's what we get.
that's what we get, a complementarity between the erotomaniac position and the fetishistic position. Okay, then thank you.
But it's true that he said some men can be as interesting as women, and the example is Saint Jean de la Croix, San Juan de la Cruz, who took a feminine position toward his God and made him speak about him. So it leaves hope not to be absolutely stuck in the men position. Of course. See, that's a little.
I was thinking of a text I love, which is a text by Freud, named Un trouble de mémoire sur l'Acropole, a memory trouble on the Acropolis, where you find an expression by Freud. It's a very interesting text. I suppose everyone's read it. It's written 30 or 20 years after the story occurs. And it's a moment when Freud is on the Acropolis, facing a symptom of uncanny, something odd, bizarre. And he interprets it in relationship to love at the end. Love for the father, but there is a qualification of that love. In French, it's traduced as impie, which is dealing with religion, impie, and opposed to, in a way. So I was wondering if the kind of love some women are addressing to some men is not of that kind. That is to say, a love direct towards another who is barred. Which is very different from loving someone unbarred, without bar. And I think Freud mentioned love for the father, but the fallen father, the barred father, it's a love including the other that doesn't exist. So in the end, you love the other that does not exist. I would have your opinion on that. And in French, we've got the German word das Ding, and Eric equivoked with Lacan on dignified. He could have had dingue, which is not, which is mad. Dingue love, un amour dingue of das Ding.
Yes, we could say, following upon, we could say that the difference between the hysteric position and the woman position as such is the love for the castrated father on the hysterical side of it, and the love for the other as bad, rather from the women position. The erotomaniac position of love is not reduced to the hysterical position. It's something else. It's the idea that it has to do with madness, with feminine madness, is that it's a zone in which precisely the name of the father is not valid anymore. It's not the name of the father that regulates that zone. It is the zone in which something can be said that's beyond, let's say, the norms or the law of the father, which is the zone rather on the side of the hysteric. And to come back to the fetichistic aspects of man's love, it included the l'amour courtois, how is it translated? Courteous love. Courtly love. Because the courtly love is precisely to, it has to be discussed, to elevate the object as the phallus, or elevate the object as das Ding. That was the whole discussion or the whole interest of Lacan, commenting upon the text, of classical text of the 11th and 12th century about courtly love, precisely. Then, if we come back to the second question, first the comment on the anecdote that is, I think, transmitted by Roudinesco, of the fact that at one day in a red light, in which precisely the stop in which Lacan was stopped, these children of the first marriage came when he was in the car with Judith. And he didn't stop or acknowledge the existence of the children of the first marriage. And if I remember well, Adam Phillips, the English psychoanalyst, commenting about the biography by Roudinesco, stating that, states in his comment that it's a real frightening anecdote about Lacan. Let's put it that way. It was probably transmitted to Roudinesco, I don't know by whom exactly, probably Laurent's Bataille. Lacan didn't have a complete unacknowledgement of the children of his first marriage, but it was difficult. It was a difficult relationship with the children of his first marriage. Like we saw, his marriage lasted 5 years. 3 children were born, and the last one was born just before Judith. And so Sibylle and Judith were not very far. They had 1 year or something like that, the difference. So it was not that easy to articulate the both. You cannot say marriages, because Lacan married Sylvia Bataille much later, in the 50s. And so this anecdote probably is a sign of embarrassment, without any doubt, but not of forclusion, because in the context, Roudinesco tries to show that there's the kind of occlusion of the name of the father there in the rejection by Lacan of that. Seems to me absolutely out of the problem. It was not, without any doubt, it was not that easy to arrange a world in which both children of the marriage, of the two marriages, could coexist. But I think they found a way, and at the end, in the funerals of Lacan, it's true that Sibylle, the last daughter, was estranged and wasn't there, but she was estranged, and she had reason for that. I mean, with Judith and her, it was not that easy. Unfortunately, one of the other daughters of the first marriage died in an accident, which was not her fault. It was someone who killed her in a road accident. And there was his son, Thibault, the mathematician from the first marriage, one of a good French mathematician, who spoke before Judith at the funeral. And I would say that the use of the anecdote as a kind of frightening reminder of the presence of occlusion as a running streak between the relationship of Lacan with his children seems to me diffamation. I think the relationship of love with the other I commented upon in my first answer to the question, so perhaps I would stay there and leave room for the Marie-Hélène and Pierre-Gilles to answer.